Hello there. Let's think together now about how to bring Foucault's account of power into conversation with the Bible. And I want to come back to this idea of the great reversal and look at it through a different passage, not Philippians 2 this time, but 1 Corinthians 1, 18 to 31. And I want to try and sketch out what we could call a cruciform understanding of power in this passage. If you remember, the passage itself is the one in which Paul commends God's foolish wisdom and weak strength. And I just want to focus on these verses for this video, verses 22 to 25. This is what Paul says. For Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So if we use this as a basis for elaborating a biblical account of power, what do we get to? What sort of paradigm do we come out with? Well, allow me, if you will, to represent it in terms of a diagram. We're going to end up eventually with an X shape to add to the V shape that we had last week. But I want to begin just with this one trajectory. At the beginning of our passage, we've got Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. So Paul has identified in the two dominant cultures into which he's ministering, the primary values, what those cultures really seek and desire and cherish. For the Jews, it's signs, it's miracles, it's overwhelming manifestations, immediate manifestations of the power of God. And for Greeks, it's wisdom, it's dexterity and eloquence, it's the ability to put your opponent down, to win in debates, to discourse about your thoughts in a pleasing and persuasive way. Now, both of these are desires for power. Either power over the other in the realm of words and rhetoric, or a face-to-face encounter with the overwhelming power of God in a miracle or a sign. So both cultures are seeking power in a particular way. But Paul meets these cultural values and expectations not with something that would seem likely to give the Jews and the Greeks what they're looking for, but in fact with something that would seem the least likely of all to satisfy their desires. He says, we preach Christ crucified, God's Messiah executed. It is easy for us today to pass over the ridiculousness, the scandal of what Paul is saying here. People come looking for wisdom, people come looking for power. We preach a crucified criminal. And we claim that he is God's rescuer. We just try and draw out some of the perversity of this switch that Paul is making here, from a search for wisdom and power to a crucified Messiah. Quoting from Kathy Ehrensberger's Paul and the Dynamics of Power, she says, to seek support for authority claims via an emphasis on weakness and suffering, in other words, a Messiah who was crucified, could be seen as anachronistic in the Hellenistic and Roman world, where such experience gave rise to contempt and intimidation rather than recognition and respect. To relate authority claims to weakness and to suffering seems at least paradoxical, if not foolish, from the perspective of a society which was saturated with values of strength and competitive dominating power. In other words, if you're looking for wisdom, and if you're looking for God's power manifested in signs, you don't look to the cross in the way that the societies at the time were thinking. And indeed, this is what Paul says. He says that Christ crucified is a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. Jews looking for power see only weakness. Greeks looking for wisdom see only folly. The Greek word that's used in 1 Corinthians 1 is the word from which we get the English moron or moronic. It's stupid for them to see anything but folly in Christ crucified. And therefore these aspirations for wisdom and for power, in the eyes of those who have them, are not met at the cross. This line here I've tried to show doesn't pass through the cross. It's repulsed by the cross and turns away, considering the cross to be a stumbling block and folly. But of course, that's not the end of the passage. Paul has one more thing to say, which is that to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And he goes on to say, doesn't he, that God's folly is wiser than man's wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than man's strength. So what Paul is saying is that for those who are willing to come to the cross with these desires for wisdom and for power, and to pass through the cross, leaving behind previous conceptions of what it means to be wise and what it means to be powerful, they will find ultimate wisdom and power in the cross, God's wisdom and God's power. They come thinking they know what wisdom and power are, and if they refuse to let go of those assumptions, they're turned away by the cross and find only a stumbling block and folly. But if they're willing to see God's wisdom and God's power in the cross, these people will find what they're looking for, Paul says. The Greek in search of wisdom will find real wisdom, God's ultimate wisdom, by going through the cross, passing through the cross. And the Jew looking for power, raw manifestation of God's miraculous power, will find no greater power than the power of the cross to save, as Paul says in Romans 1, all who believe. Let me just try and bring this out by quoting Paul Helm from his Providence of God. He says, according to Paul, such wisdom and power is literally wisdom and power. God's wisdom and God's power, the wisdom and power of the cross, are the definition of wisdom and power. It's not that the wisdom of the Greeks is literally wisdom and the wisdom of the cross loosely or metaphorically or symbolically so. There is a moral or spiritual refraction which prevents all men and women seeing divine wisdom as such, but such it is. This is how God really is. God's moral and spiritual character is such that the cross is entirely congruous with it, and is perhaps, though this is more controversial, the only expression of that divine wisdom and power could have taken when faced with the human predicament. So in other words, to come back to our diagram here we go. The only way for the Jew to be utterly satisfied in their search for power, the only way for the Greek to be utterly satisfied in their search for wisdom, is to go via the cross, but this means a non-linear letting go of preconceptions of what wisdom is and preconceptions of what power is, and finding them in the most unlikely of places. That wisdom is found in the stupidity of a crucified criminal, that power is found in the absolute weakness of a moment of death in agony and shame on the cross. So again, you see, we've got the cruciform rupture right at the heart of this dynamic, a need to interrupt the narratives of power that predominate in a culture, and to upend and overturn them, to come to an understanding of wisdom and power that is the antithesis of what was expected. And it's only through that rupture that true wisdom and true power can be found.